Hello, everyone. I'm going to review Measure for Measure by William Shakespeare. Now, I'm not going to cover everything in the play because I want to make this review very concise, but there will be some minor spoilers along the way. But this is a very unique and interesting play because, in many ways, it is almost a mirror image of the play Macbeth. It really struck me while I was reading it that while Macbeth represents darkness, Measure for Measure, although there is a lot of darkness in it, represents light. Because in many ways, Shakespeare's language is music, but what is music exactly? Well, I believe music is the language of the soul, but the soul has both darkness and light within it. And whereas Macbeth takes that language and uses it to explore darkness. In Measure for Measure, you hear the language of light, and I think that is the fundamental difference there. And so it's a very fascinating dichotomy in that way. And so in the play Measure for Measure, you have Vienna, where you have the Duke of Vienna who decides that he is going to take a step back and not rule his country anymore, and he's going to leave it to his deputy Angelo to do it. And so the Duke disappears. And so you have the character of Angelo, who is in many ways a very self righteous person. He is a very morally pious person, and he really wants to uphold the law. Well, he tries to do that by convicting a man named Claudio, who is guilty of lechery or fornication. And so he is placed in prison and is going to be executed. But then you have the character of Isabella, who goes to Angelo and pleads with him, and she is also studying to be a nun, and she pleads with him to let her brother go in a way that is very passionate and heartfelt. And I really loved the poetry and her language in that scene, the way she describes mercy, and she melts the heart of Angelo, even though he is very cold. And Angelo ultimately decides, okay, I will, but first you have to do me a favor. And so he essentially propositions her so she will sleep with him. Well, of course, Isabella is shocked and she refuses. She sees the hypocrisy that Angelo is in many ways far worse um, than the person he is condemning. And Isabella, in many ways, again, is a mirror image of Lady Macbeth. That Isabella represents pure light, whereas Lady Macbeth represents pure darkness. And so there's an interesting dichotomy there. And but even by the end, when the Duke returns and decides to establish justice, even then when he is going to inflict justice on Angelo, she still pleads for mercy, even though um, Angelo propositioned her, even though she thinks at least that he killed her brother. She is still willing to do that. And to me, I think the central theme of the play is that mercy is very important, that justice without mercy isn't really justice. And so many characters in the play receive compassion even when they don't really deserve it. And so the message is quite human in that regard. And I think there are a lot of religious overtones. And in fact, the title Measure for Measure actually comes from a quote from, I believe, Matthew in the Bible, where it's about measure for measure. You get what you ultimately dish out. And so there's this element of justice in the play, but it's also about leniency, about mercy, about how justice without mercy isn't justice, it's tyranny. And so and there's also this test in the end that shows that Angelo is in many ways just as corrupt as the system that he's trying to rule, and how all men are flawed, and therefore we should never be too convinced of our own moral righteousness, that we need to be humble in that regard. And so I believe that Measure for Measure is a very human play, and Shakespeare weaves that through language, through music, in order to create, in many ways, a symphony uh, of of humanity, of mercy, of pleading for understanding. And in that regard, the darkness is pushed away until you hear only melodies of light. And to me, that is what makes Measure for Measure such a great play. And so I highly enjoyed it, and I would highly recommend that you read it or see a version of it, because it is a very enriching play.